Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're reviewing Pulp by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. I assume most of you out there have heard of Ed Brubaker. He's written for Marvel for a bunch of comics, mostly Captain America, but also Secret Avengers and other stuff. He's written for a bunch of companies, in fact, and he's also worked with Sean Phillips, the artist of this particular book on a bunch of stories. I know him from Criminal, but also Fatale, Kill or Be Killed, The Fade Out, My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies, and now Pulp. A pretty cool story that I quite enjoyed on the whole. This is a graphic novel about a pulp novelist in 1939, living in, I believe, New York City. Yes. And he writes about old westerns, and they even reference, actual pulp magazines from those eras. So he just kind of tells those type of stories, and we get lots of flashes of what those stories are and that sort of thing. And we basically learn. When I came into this story, I assumed it was going to kind of be like two different stories combined in different time periods, but it's all quite unified, and it's really focused on this novelist who is, older, so he actually grew up in like right up into the 1890s and stuff, and thus lived in what we can call the Old West and was basically a cowboy of sorts. I don't want to give away too much more than that, but the idea very much is that the pulp novels that he writes are based on his time as like an actual rogue cowboy thief robbing people and fighting like Pinkerton agents out in the Old West, which is kind of striking, but is the history of America where like people lived in this unclaimed land, and I didn't really think about it much, but very much within a lifetime that changed until the into the early of 20th century, where like he's walking around in New York City with a subway, cars, and all that stuff. It's kind of cool connecting these two time periods because certainly we've seen stories from either era, obviously Old West, like that's a whole genre, and then even the 1930s is a popular setting for all sorts of stories. But combining the two was quite interesting. I also really like it because this is just a graphic novel, all completely standalone. You don't have to read a bunch of issues to know what's going on here. You don't have to like wait for however long for a sequel to come out or something like that. I struggle to imagine making a sequel out of this story, and I would not look forward to one. Theoretically, they could do something with a prequel, digging back into those cowboy eras, but this isn't that kind of story. Now, well, there are qualifications, I guess we'll say, to all of this, but I do very much like this comic. Aside from astounding artwork by Sean Phillips, uh, there's just like a really well crafted story in here. It's not a long graphic novel, like it's pretty thin. I don't actually know how many pages it is, but it's got to be like around 100 or so. Doesn't say. 150 maybe at most. So a really limited story, but it's got a lot going on, and it's a really cool structured story too. In the beginning of the book and several times thereafter, the main character, who also narrates a lot of the story, says that his story has a lot of beginnings, and it kind of almost starts out in a very pretentious way where it's flashing back and forward in time and stuff like that. And it almost kind of, my interest was, I will say, wavering a bit, or just was a little off because of that dynamic at first. But really, it made sense that like it had to introduce all those things because for a relatively short story, it does have some pretty complicated plot threads going on. There's a lot to the main character's past. I probably should know names going into it. Oh, and Jacob Phillips did the coloring, as I'm flipping past that. But I don't know. Regardless, um, he like there's a lot of key revelations that happen over time that I don't think is worth giving away. But there are some cool aspects to it overall. Max is the main character, and Max is a well written kind of dude. He's not an unblemished protagonist, but he's not just like some miserable wretch. But there's something compelling about this character, like just focusing on this old man who's lived this completely alien life to what we know today, but is living in a city that's not so alien. It's a cool dynamic, and you end up rooting for him quite a bit, even though this story makes it perfectly clear he's not a great person, but it's easy to understand where he came from. So, for example, he killed and robbed a lot of people back in his like cowboy days, but early on they explain how he got started doing that, and basically he lived on his family farm. And then these land barons came along and tried to buy them out, and when they refused, they just burned down their home and shot them, like with the intention of killing them. And Max barely made it out alive, and his brother died. And a lot of his cowboy stories are kind of him coming to terms with those experiences. And he writes about like two cowboys partners. I don't know if they're brothers in the story, but they're based on his brother and him and their adventures. Well, his adventures later as a cowboy, that he sort of created this fictional we'll say like blanket over it or something. Like he's sort of telling a whitewashed version of what actually happened, but it's made very clear like, oh, he just did violent things. At first targeting the people that burned down his home and killed his brother, but then just, anyone that he could steal from. And he talks about, oh, like, I liked it, and we did go to work with it. And then like that's all early stuff. It kind of leaves a blank period where it doesn't really explain how he ended up living in New York City as writer, but over time it's made clear how that happens, and it's really moving stuff. I wasn't like moved to tears by this book, but I was definitely emotionally engaged in it in a way that I haven't felt in some time. We've reviewed a couple of indie books recently. In some ways, this story reminded me of A World Without Gravity, um, but that Gravity book, while it kind of touched on similar themes in a very different setting, didn't quite engage me as much. It was more of an artistic piece, whereas this is a proper merger of story and art that really brings you in. Another cool thing is that Max eventually meets this gentleman who's, well, he used to be a Pinkerton agent, and he basically convinces Max to get into this one last heist with him. And that character, we learn a lot more about this former agent, and he's a really moving character that I really related to. And this story, so this is the one downside of the story, and I kind of mentioned I have a couple of issues, we'll say, with it, or like mild criticisms. One is that it starts out on somewhat rocky footing, because, like I said, it felt a little overweighted in terms of how it was like, oh, we're gonna flash forward and back and use a lot of narration and establishing panels and that sort of thing to like tell an artistic story. But over time, it just became clear, oh, that was actually meaningfully used to set up a story properly, which is good. But the one thing I will say as a criticism is, you guys have seen the cover coming and going, but if you have listened to what I've used to the words I've used to describe this plot, or like if you look at the cover in particular, you'll notice there's a bit of a mishmash because this thing looks like a western, and I talked a lot about all these events taking place in a western, but by and large, this story takes place in the 1930s and is about a writer of westerns who lived through it, but it's not the same thing. And I think that should be made clear, because if you go into this book like expecting, oh, cool, Ed Brubaker wrote like an Old West cowboy book, and it does kind of look like that right on this cover here, you're going to be disappointed, because this is a more, well, it's two things. It's a more interpersonal story about an old man trying to like leave something behind for this his wife and this woman he cares about, and coming to terms with all the stuff he's did when he was younger. Um, And by the way, that's really, really well done and left me feeling old. uh, like, the Max is in his 70s and I'm only 30, but yeah, it just left me so terrified of aging in a weird way. I've always had a bit of a, or it's certainly gotten more pronounced as I get older, a thing about aging and stuff like that. And this book doesn't advertise it well, but it does get you into the mindset of someone at the end of their life, and it's rough stuff. It was almost hard to read in that regard, but not because it was bad in any way. It was well done content that you know affected me uh, in an emotional way, and it made me come to confront something in myself about all of this. So yeah, that was a lot. But the other thing it is quite political, which isn't a surprise for anyone who has read an Ed Brubaker book before. But it really digs into the politics of the 1939, and you know that makes sense. It was certainly a political time, and it really gets into the fascists that were active and campaigning in America at the time in a way that, you know, I was sold on hook, line, and sinker. When that stuff is all said and done, it is so properly executed and cathartic. Ed Brubaker did a good job with that. No, I can't think of anything unrealistic about what happened with the Nazis. It was all really well done. Um, so I quite enjoyed this story. It wasn't what I expected, but it was a highly polished, well structured, uh, emotionally interesting story about this guy, and very different, from the average comic book graphic novel, even by indie standards. Though I was thinking about this a lot when reading this book, and how Ed Brubaker is a very different kind of character or writer than what we would get out of most people in the industry. Like across the board, indie or big two, there are certainly similar writers, especially in the past. One thing it really reminded me of, and it's no coincidence, is the pulp novels that they this story's kind of all framed by, because he's a writer of those books. And was thinking Ed Brubaker kind of has that style to him. It's not the same thing exactly, but it's the same sort of tone where it's very grounded compared to a lot of superhero stuff and even sci-fi fantasy, such as that Gravity graphic novel I mentioned earlier. And instead, Brubaker tends to focus on more human moments, and it works really well in a period piece where we're going back in time and looking at a different era with a very honest lens, which Brubaker does really well. I He's a bit, I don't know if I want to call it generic, or he's very open with his politics. He's never going to go out on too much of a limb and ever say anything too controversial. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, especially when it's like kind of more of a secondary plot or tertiary plot, I'd say, in the case of Pulp, and it really informs one of the characters in a particular way. So it's all good. So yes, definitely a good book. But yeah, I hope I conveyed adequately though. Even by, and I don't want to say indie books are automatically elevated. There's plenty of great stuff coming out of Marvel and DC that actually tops a lot of indie stuff. But this, even by Brubaker standards, I wasn't impressed. I was just oh, this was something else. It was a unique experience, and like I said, I really appreciated just a concise story that just completely perfectly handles itself on its own. And like I said earlier on in the beginning, I wouldn't really want a sequel or a prequel or anything like that. I like it like this, where I can just hand this to a friend, no matter what their experience is with books, and just be here, check this out. You might like it, especially if they are interested in whatever genre this might pretend to be. It blends quite a few different genres, so I think a lot of people would be interested in that thing and enjoy it. It's a good gift too, because it's a relatively short book. Even that hardcover was relatively cheap by book standards, and like a lot of people will write off comics because they're just superhero stuff, but which is fair enough, I guess. Though I personally think that's a bit of a misunderstanding about how those kind of stories work. Something like this can challenge a lot of notions about comics and what they can do because this is sophisticated and smart, well executed, beautifully drawn. Uh, Phillips does a great job with the coloring, but or not sorry, the artwork, but I only briefly mentioned the guy whose name I keep forgetting, Jacob Phillips, who does the coloring, and I really like the coloring. The image you guys are seeing on screen right now, the contrast between like the stark colors of the modern city against the lush warmth and sparse coloring, but all just sort of this red, we'll say splashes of memory, work really well in like making the West just seem like this distant past, while also constantly kind of reminding us that it's only been 30 or 40 years in the eyes of these characters. It's cool stuff and made me look back on the 1930s and 20s, 40s even, with a slightly different lens. It's not a way that we normally think about history, where people just sort of exist in this isolation or grew up in the eras that we think of. That's not true. Not with this guy and not with a lot of people then, and that's cool. I like history and learning about that stuff. I hadn't, I don't know, fully conceptualized it, and certainly didn't go into the story thinking about that character in such a way until the story basically spelled it out for me, which is neat. It was great. So yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching this review, and we'll leave it there. See you guys next time with my next review, where we'll be taking a look at the Cable series. So stay tuned for that, and thanks again for watching, guys.